This episode of the Practice of Therapy podcast is brought to you by Blueprint Health. Find out more by going to practiceoftherapy.com/blueprint health. And also it is brought to you by TherapyNotes. And you can find out more about them by going to practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes. Hello, I'm Gordon Brewer, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy podcast, where we explore the business and clinical sides of running a private practice. Hello, this is Gordon Brewer, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy podcast, and this is episode number 216 of the podcast. Welcome, everyone. Glad you're here. Glad you're listening in, and hope you're doing well. And if this is the first time that you've listened to the podcast, welcome. Hope you'll come back and listen to more episodes. It's hard to believe we're up to 216 now. Been doing this for a while now. I realized the other day that I started the podcast actually back in 2017. So there's a lot of water under the bridge since then. But one of the things about this particular episode, if you'll go all the way back to episode number 4 of the podcast when I started it, you'll get to hear that guest on this one as well. And that's my good friend, Dr. David Hall. He was actually the first person I interviewed on the podcast. And David and I have just a wonderful friendship, and he's one of my best cohorts and colleagues in this whole space. David is the person behind Psych Maven, and you can find out more about them at psychmaven.org. But one of the things about people like David, and when I say people like David, I'm really holding him up as an example of the kind of person that all of us needs to have if we're in private practice, and that is a trusted colleague and friend that we can bounce things off of. And David and I get together, we chat at least once a week or at least every other week, just checking in with each other and seeing how things are going within our practices. If we need to vent about something that's going on in our practice, whether it's with our employees or just whatever might be going on, David is my go-to with that. And David and I have collaborated on a lot of stuff over this last few years, with his collaborating with his organization, Psych Maven, psychmaven.org. And David really has spent a lot of time in teaching other counselors and therapists about setting up continuing education courses and also creating other streams of income within their practice. So anyway, looking forward to you hearing my conversation with David, where we just talk about some of the growing pains of running a practice. So I'm going to get to David here in a minute, but before we do, a couple of things I want to let you know about. One is, and then we mentioned this in this particular episode, is that David and I have put together another webinar just on scaling your practice. And you can find out more about that by going to practiceoftherapy.com/group. You can check that out. There's a free webinar that we've put together. It's an automated webinar, so you get to pick the time that you want to watch it, where David and I just talk about some of the common growing pains around running a group practice, or some of the misconceptions that people have around starting a group. And so it's a free webinar. Love for you to check it out. And the other webinar that I've got out, that is another automated webinar that you get to pick your time and decide when you want to watch it, is the webinar that I did on using Google Workspace in private practice. And if you'll go over to practiceoftherapy.com webinars. That's where you can locate the link to that particular webinar on using Google Workspace in private practice. And actually, the other webinar that I mentioned that David and I will be at that same location, so you can get to it either way. But the best way to find out about all the current webinars, and my webinars are nearly always free, so it's just a free resource for you. And you, as I said, we're moving to having more automated webinars, so you get to pick the time, because I know it's sometimes it's hard for people to find the right times. So anyway, looking forward to you hearing my conversation with David. But before we do that, I'd love for you to hear from our sponsors of the podcast, and that is Blueprint Health and also TherapyNotes. As your practice grows, the systems and processes you have in place will keep your practice running smoothly. That's why it's important to have an electronic health record system that is specific to mental health providers. TherapyNotes is a complete practice management system with everything you need to manage patient records, schedule appointments, meet with patients remotely, create rich documentation, and bill insurance, all right at your fingertips. Their streamlined software is accessible wherever and whenever you need it. They're who I use in my practice. And did I mention that they are one of the top-rated EHRs for mental health providers? Their support is also second to none. So be sure to check them out at practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes. And be sure to use the promo code Gordon, just GORDON, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. That's therapynotes.com. And this episode is also brought to you by Blueprint Health. One of the best ways to serve clients in your practice is through measurement-based outcomes. In fact, more and more third-party payers, aka insurance companies, are demanding measurable outcomes. And with more and more emphasis on good mental health, having a way to measure your outcomes just makes sense. Introducing Blueprint, the measurement-based care platform that administers, scores, and charts hundreds of symptom rating scales to give clinicians deeper insights into treatment progress. Ultimately, by helping behavioral health providers to grow top-line practice revenue, increase clinician satisfaction, and deliver more effective care. So be sure and check them out by going to practiceoftherapy.com/blueprint health. And by going to that URL, you can also get your first month free. Again, that's practiceoftherapy.com/blueprint health. Well, welcome again to the Practice of Therapy podcast. Hello, David Hall. Glad you're back.
I'm good. I am. Has anyone been on the podcast more than me, Gordon?
I don't know. Probably not. I think you're pushing the envelope here. So that's a good thing. So, but for those of you that don't know, Dr. David Hall is one of my primary colleagues in just this whole space. And David and I have known each other going on probably 5, 6, maybe 7 years. 10 years. Wow.
10 years, Gordon.
That's hard to believe. And so one of the topics that's kind of risen to the top for us here lately is just growing pains, and that we both are experiencing it in different ways. But before we get into that, David, for those folks out there that might not know anything about you, tell them a little bit about you and your journey and where you are and how you landed where you've landed.
It is a journey. It's a weird journey. Yes, as Gordon said, my name is Dr. David Hall. I am the creative lead of PsychMaven, psychmaven.org. We provide continuing education courses and other curated business resources and practice growing things for behavioral health professionals. And you can find us at psychmaven.org. I also am a group practice owner in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is about an hour and a half from where Gordon is. And among other things, I've got my own podcast launching in the planning first quarter of 2022, The Fresh Therapist. It is a lifestyle and humor podcast for therapists. And Gordon, I've already promised Gordon our first interview spot because I was Gordon's first interview spot. And so it feels need to be reciprocal. But you can find that at freshtherapist.com. And so those are the different things that I do. And, Gordon and I met. I love telling the story. When I started doing continuing education workshops, the first independent workshop I did was in 2012. And the first person that ever paid me for a workshop independently was Gordon. And that's how we met. Yeah. We had not I didn't know, I had cold emailed Gordon. I found his contact information on a therapy directory. It wasn't Psychology Today. It's something that's defunct now, I think.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is a therapist that isn't too far. Maybe he wants to come to this training. And he did. And he bought it. And that's how we met. And so Gordon was the first person that ever paid me to do a training. So I've been a relationship I've cherished in the years since.
Yes. Ditto to all of that for me. One of the things that David and I have been collaborating on, and I know that there's probably some listeners out there that have happened upon this or heard about it from me, but we've put together a webinar just on going from solo practice to group practice, but we've kind of tweaked it a little bit here recently to really thinking about what are the kind of the growing pains that you go through in your practices and how we handle those things. But that's what David and I wanted to talk about today is just, those things that come up in our practices where really can be just kind of a pain in the butt to handle in your practice, but it's part of growth and being able to accept some of that, some of those difficulties. So, David, what is it that comes to mind for you when you think of growing pains and just really some of the things that you've experienced?
Oh, the first thing that comes to mind is money, but that's it's stretching, and it can be like growth in our physical bodies. It can be good in the end, but pain is, I think, the key word for growing pains. Gordon and I, as Gordon shared, we talk probably at least once a week about things related to our businesses and what we do. And both Gordon and I have multiple things we do in our professional space. And one of the things that we've been talking through with each other in the last several months is how to have more defined silos in organization and finances. That, we think of our different businesses differently, but oftentimes it can muddy the waters because both of us at different ways and different times have had the money going in the same pot. And, we both made efforts in the last several months to kind of separate things out. And so we can see how each, thing we're doing is working by itself and, what needs to be tweaked. And it is, I think it's just hard when you grow. I mean, right now, Gordon, you've got a team of 7. Have you ever had more people than that?
No, this is really and that doesn't include the virtual assistant that I have working for me as well. And so, managing that number of people is a new thing for me.
I'm at 14 in my team, which is, I think, the largest I've ever gotten. Maybe I ran a psychiatry practice before, and I'm trying to think of different admin. So it may have been close then, my initial group practice was 2 other therapists and me. So we were a practice of 3. And doing a practice of 3 is very different than doing a practice of 14.
Right.
And I'm not really organized. That's not one of the things I'm known for. I can get things done, but it usually requires a lot of anxiety on my end and guilt to push through things. And so it is, I think, as we talk about it, Gordon, I'm curious what it is for you. A word that's coming to mind as we're talking through it is there's kind of a disorientation, I feel, in growth. Not that I can't reorientate or kind of get my bearings, but it's sort of like, okay, where am I? Where is everything? It's hard to have a feeling of high touch with everything you're doing when you're growing.
Right. Yeah. As I think about that, and I know this is something that I've struggled with as well, is being grounded in my why, as I like to call it. What
Mm-hmm.
is well, ultimately, what is the purpose of my growth? Why do I want to grow? Why do I want to add more clinicians and all of that sort of thing? And I think for me is, something that's on my radar is just thinking about retirement and eventually getting out of kind of the clinical side of things and moving more fully into kind of the consulting side of things where I've kind of built the practice of therapy and that platform and what that looks like and that sort of thing. And wearing those two hats is finding a balance with that. But also just with anytime we're scaling anything, it does require being able to outsource things more. And I think giving up that control to some degree has been, to some degree a struggle point for me. But it's, yeah. And I know one of the things you and I have talked about several times is just finding that balance. But both David and I are Enneagram 2s. So we are naturally kind of generous people and wanting to be, pay our people well. We want them to be want them to have a great place to work and that sort of thing. But we also can do that to a fault to some degree. And so
Gordon and I have both faulted in it at different times. And as I've only recently got into Enneagram, and for those who haven't, yet, check out psychmaven.org. We've got some resources on that. I have a great course that we host, Whitney and James Owens, that teach, and that's what really kind of got me deeper in it. But one of the things I learned about the Enneagram 2s is that under stress, we move to 8. And 8 is the challenger. And it's like, and for me, where I have to balance is I like being generous. I like but when I feel people are not as grateful as I want them to be, or then there's a part of myself, and I will clarify too. Oftentimes I have very grateful people I work with, staff and other people. I don't really deal with people that are pretty ungrateful, but I can, in myself, get really in that mindset, and it's a stressor. And but going back to Gordon's thing of knowing your why is, I think, a good touch point to kind of go back to. And the other thing is really systems. And I think one of the hard things about embracing systems sometimes is to do that well, we have to be willing to give up a certain amount of control. And for me, that's hard. I won't speak for Gordon. For me, that's hard. But like one of the things that Gordon and I have been talking about collaboratively is investing more into some collaborative VA resources this year. That's one of our things we're talking about in 2022, because we both use VAs, but there's certain things that we do that we think we could actually share resources. And I recently shared a podcast episode with Gordon. For those who are interested, it's the online course show with Jacques Hopkins, and it's episode 98, and talking about outsourcing with virtual assistants. And I was really inspired by the episode and feeling like possibilities. And so what I do is I send it to Gordon. Gordon and I send podcast episodes to each other constantly. and I'm like, do you want to? But for me, as I look at it, I realized that for me to grow in a healthy way, I've got to be willing to offload some things. But the pain point is giving up the control that will require.
Right. Yeah. It's I think in the last episode I told the story just about how I'm kind of a consummate tinkerer, and I enjoy, I kind of enjoy learning the process of bootstrapping, but it's not always a great use of my time. I can get lost in the bootstrapping part of it, which ends up bogging me down. And then all the other stuff that gets handed to me just becomes overwhelming at that point. And so being able to know how to kind of divvy it out and being able to, again, going back to what you said, David, the systems and processes of handing that off to people, of being able to, know they're not going to do it the way I would do it exactly, but in the end, they'll get it to the finish line, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, and related to that, and as an Enneagram 2, this is something I struggle with. It's holding people accountable, because oftentimes I'll make a request and someone's not just that they're not performing in the way that I expect, but it's not happening. And I'm quick to say, oh, it's fine. I'll do it. Mm-hmm. And it's enabling an unhealthy system. And I've had to really challenge myself in this phase of career and life to not do that.
Yes.
Because the bootstrapping thing that Gordon talks about, like when you're really starting out, and depending on where you are in your work and practice journey, that could be absolutely what you need to be doing. Because you may have time and not a lot of other resources to spend. And so bootstrapping, but there comes a point in any professional journey, if you're growing, that you can't keep doing that you're doing a disservice, not just to yourself, but to other people by continuing to bootstrap, because you're eating up your time and emotional resources doing things that you don't have to do, that somebody else could do in a more efficient way, in a less expensive way. And if you're leading a team of any size, it becomes your responsibility of your time isn't just for you. It becomes a responsibility that you owe to other people as well. And that's what I've had to really reframe for myself to force myself in that. Okay, I've got to let this go for this to be healthy.
Right. Yeah. It's stuff that we, a lot of times, it's stuff that we say to our clients as mental health providers, but we don't, it becomes difficult to apply to ourselves. Do as I say, not as I do.
Well, and that's the thing. Yeah. And Gordon and I both say this as teachers and consultants, and I do hope you check out. It's up now as this podcast episode is coming out. It's our Scaling Without Failing automated webinar. We've done it live, and then we ended up redoing it. We tweaked it some. Again, we tinkered, made it, streamlined it a bit more, and now it's available in an automated scheduled format. And you can find that at practiceoftherapy.com/group.
Yeah. And you can also go to the practiceoftherapy.com/webinars, and there'll be a link for it there as well.
Yeah. One of the things we talk about it's a lot of do as we say, not as we do. But part of, and I don't take that as hypocrisy. I take that as we were very serious in this lesson. We just haven't learned it completely yet ourselves, but it doesn't mean it's not a true lesson. And we share in this webinar, we share a lot of our experiences of why the things we share about scaling are important, because there isn't a single thing that I do not think there's a single thing we share in the webinar session that isn't something that was an acute pain point for us, sometimes multiple times.
Right.
And it's why we want to share it with you, so you don't have to go through the pain in the same way.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. I've always said that I've learned a lot of stuff the hard way, and I don't think everybody else should necessarily have to do it that way.
Yeah. And so that's what really inspires Gordon and I as consultants and teachers. It is that we don't want it to be as hard for everybody else. A lot of what drives us that we've talked about with each other is we want to be the people that we wish we had in different phases of our career. I would have loved I love knowing Gordon now, but it would have made a huge difference in my journey as a clinician if I had met him 15 years ago, if I met the version of Gordon now 15 years ago, with his experience and kind of what he has, because there are a lot of shortcuts he could have given me.
Right.
And I think of that for myself. If I had met my younger self, there are a lot of shortcuts I could give me. And so if I think of that, I think about how can I do that for other people that work as mental health providers.
Right. So David, as you think about growing pains, is there a particular anecdote or story you could share that
Know your
kind of top of
numbers.
your mind. Yeah.
Know your numbers. I think that's something Gordon says all the time. It's something I now say all the time. I'm a feely sort of person, and the problem is I will make financial decisions a lot more about how I feel about money in that moment than what I actually need or don't need or what the actual numbers say. I feel it's not always in the generosity direction. Sometimes it's in the tight direction. Sometimes I'll be too restrictive financially because I feel that, or I will be too loose because it feels like, oh yeah, the money's coming in, it's great. And I've really, I'm not, I did a liberal arts degree. I'm not a trained business person or a math person, but I've really had to learn Excel or whatever system you use, spreadsheets well. And, I've really, and I've learned to be diligent in looking at inputting data, looking at it, checking it. It can't be how I feel because emotions are fickle. And to really scale well, I need to have, it's sort of like my father's learning how to fly right now. And so we talk about it a lot. And but in airplanes, there are things like artificial horizons in the plane where you fly by instrument because sometimes you don't have the visuals. And I think to grow well, you need to have good instruments of whatever that is so am I on course? It can't just be like, because if you're flying a plane, you're not checking your panels, you can be oriented wrong and for deadly results. And I think the same thing can happen in your growing.
Right.
So that's, anecdote. I think I've lost touch of my numbers at different times. And part of it is as numbers grow, it's easier to lose touch. Like as, when you have a smaller gross revenue in your practice and fewer clinicians, it's easier to keep track of the pieces. And as your gross revenue goes up and your expenses go up and your clinicians go up, or, in my teaching business, I've got about 12 courses, large courses planned out for 2022. And in 2020, I think I did 5. So there're just more pieces to play, to keep track of and all that. So I think that's it, realizing that, to scale well, you can't touch everything. And that's the metaphor I think of, like, I can't. And so I need the systems in place to really let me know, am I on track? But yeah, it's, and the other thing about that comes to mind is as administrative, something small happens, or something that would be small if you're a solo practitioner. But when that same thing changes, a price goes up on a product, but you times that by 14, it is. So that's not a specific anecdote, it's just a principle. But yeah, what about for you, Gordon?
Yeah, that's I think kind of along the same lines. I think one growing point that I think back on for me, and again, it's tied to knowing your numbers, is when it was the point at which I switched from having contractors to employees. And so when I felt good that I'm paying them this high percentage and, I'm being very generous and all of that. But when I sat down and looked at my numbers, I was not making any money because I was taking not only what I produced, in other words, from the clients that I saw, to pay them the additional because I didn't look at my numbers. And so, I ended up, I had some people that stayed with me and, when I made that transition, but for the most part, I lost most of the people that were with me at that time because, I was being overly generous with them and they weren't willing to take the pay cut. But actually it ended up with the people that stayed with me, it ended up that they ended up doing much better moving to being an employee because they were no longer having to pay that self-employment tax.
Sometimes to grow, you have to prune. And I think maybe that's an example as well, like because, Gordon, he's at the largest practice he's ever had now, but he had a larger group before and then it shrunk when you did the transition. And some of it was you had people that worked with you that they moved on, to do different things anyway. But I think sometimes we think healthy growth is a unidirectional thing, that it's always, I if it's growing a group practice, it's like I have 2 people, then I have 4 people, then I have And the truth is, you can run the best group ever.
Mm-hmm.
It will fluctuate. People, if you attend the webinar, Gordon and I talk about what the size of our practice is when we record it. And it goes like I haven't had a lot of turnover in my group practice, but I have had turnover. People leave for any number of reasons, or people are encouraged to leave for any number of reasons.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that can feel really discouraging because it feels like, I'm going in the wrong direction. But, for Gordon, as what he just shared, like that was, you have to change that direction, because basically Gordon was paying people to work for him. Like, but well, of course you're paying people to work for it, but like you were supplementing people's pay out of your client fees. And so it was kind of moving against the whole point of having other therapists in your practice.
It wasn't sustainable in that scenario. And it was just simply the mistake I made is that I did not look at my numbers close enough. Like you were saying earlier, I made a decision based on, this feels good,
Yeah.
So, it felt right. And in actuality, it wasn't. So,
and if you have a group practice, like part of the sustainable is an important phrase that Gordon brought up. And it's really important to have it sustainable, because if it's not, then nobody, you're not serving the clients you're serving as a group. People don't have jobs. Oftentimes, whether they're independent contractors or employees, there can be a short-sightedness, not necessarily to a fault, but it's just they're in a different role of like, well, I'm making less money, I don't want to do this. It's like, well, but unless we make this adjustment, there's no practice. Those are hard decisions. And it's particularly hard. I think one of the biggest things as a leader, whatever role you have, is to be able to admit mistakes to yourself and others. And if you have this idea that being a good practice leader involves, always saving face, and it always, you can try that. I wouldn't recommend it.
Right.
I've had some very honest conversations with my staff at times about times that I've not even that I made a mistake, but just this idea of, COVID's been a great example for that. We've had a lot of protocols in place in how we run the physical space of our office in COVID, and it's fluctuated. And I have people that have been more on board than others about the things I've done. And I've said this multiple times to my staff as we were going through the pandemic was, look, I accept that decisions I'm making may not be the right decision, but somebody has to make a decision, and I'm the person in that seat. So I'm not going to stand behind that this is completely right and that nothing will change, but someone's got to decide something, and that's me.
Right. Well, I know another thing that you and I have talked about, David, is a part of the growing pains thing is to be able to accept and know that you're going to have some painful moments along the way. In that it's, I think that we aspire to have like a well-oiled machine, but there's always going to be things that crop up. I think one of the hard ones is some of you and I both experienced this, where we've had some of the clinicians that we were so proud of to have, they up and decide to leave. And so that's always a tough blow, but then you recover from that. And then the other extreme is that having clinicians or people that are just not a good fit, and they're not pulling their weight and performing well, and having to let them go. And those are both, when those things happen, it is a great growth experience. To say
it is. It is a painful one. When people quit, particularly people who quit that you don't want to quit, I know for me, it can touch on a lot of, you can call it ego, but it's also the sense of like, am I good enough? Am I like in this fear? Oftentimes that will create fear in me of like, is everyone going to go? Like when anyone has chosen to go, it's like, or am I going to be, and that often will lead me to make poor boundary decisions because I'm trying to keep people settled, or the idea if someone needs to go, it's funny. I'm not super conflict avoidant as a therapist, But as a boss, I can be. And I've had to really challenge that in myself.
Right.
And I've had, and Gordon and I have talked about it quite a bit, and we've shared different versions of this anecdote. But Gordon was going through a situation, and one of the things he said to me was, I'm not very, you needed to fire somebody. And he goes, I'm not really good at this. And I said, well, Gordon, of course you're not good at this. You're a therapist. The instinct to fire people and the instinct to be a mental health provider are not the same instinct. They kind of were encounter to each other. Yeah. But where empathy and compassion and kindness and all these things are so important in our therapy work and a lot of relationships, is important component of being a boss.
Right.
But it has to be tempered by boundaries.
Right. Really does. Well, David, I want to be respectful of your time. And I'm sure, I know that David will be back on the podcast at some point here in the future. Did want to mention that we do have this new webinar that we've kind of talked about, and I did double check it. It's practiceoftherapy.com/group without an S. And you can find that, and we'll have that in the show notes here, but really would invite everybody to go over and check that out. Whether you're thinking about going in group practice or not, I think it's good information that we've put together just about, growing pains and just really things that we've learned along the way about scaling your practice and being able to kind of take it to the next level.
Yeah. One of the things we say in the webinar that we designed it for people who are in solo practice and are thinking about going into group, but it's also, we probably speak just as much, if maybe not a little more, to people who already are in group practice and are thinking about what does growth look like, or people that are not even in practice at all. You may be an employee somewhere and you're just trying to look out future wise and it goes to what Gordon was talking about of having a clear idea of why. Because I think a lot of people assume that their why always will lead them to being in solo practice, being on their own. And I had a conversation with a staff member of mine very recently, and they were saying basically they were looking at their numbers and what they were able to make as a context in the context of the group. And they're like, I don't really think I could do better on my own, and I don't really want to be on my own. So, but I think for those of us who go through this journey, I think we all kind of assume that's the end point. Maybe not everybody, but I think a lot of us assume it's going to look like this. Right. And a lot of what we get into the webinar is maybe it looks like that. And if it does, let us help you see some things, we call them transformational tips because they were very transformational for us when we finally learned them through experience.
Right.
To help you see, is this good for me? Would it not be? And what's the timing and all those questions? So yeah, really hope you all check that out. It's an automated format. So you can watch it a lot of different times, and we really hope you can get value out of that.
Yeah. And again, there'll be links in the show summaries and show notes. And just another thing too, just to give folks just a little bit of a leadway. I know another project that David and I are working on is in particularly around David's expertise and having continuing education courses and teaching people how to do those types of things. We're going to be doing some more information on that. And
just go back. You'll have to look up, and Gordon, plug this in the show notes. We did an episode, it was either 2019 or 2020, about where I came on talking about doing CE courses. And so it's since then, I've grown my offerings quite a bit to help, because as Gordon was alluding to, I've been a continuing education provider for over 10 years at this point. I can tell you it's one of the biggest things since the pandemic. A lot more people have been interested on diversifying their income, and we'll have some more resources through practice of therapy on that.
Yeah, sure thing. So, well, David, thanks again for being on the podcast, and be sure and check David out at psychmaven.org. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed listening in on my conversation with my good friend, Dr. David Hall, and just give you some things to think about just around the growing pains of running a practice. And I'm sure there are a lot of you out there that can maybe commiserate to some degree, but I think the main point is that all of this stuff of running a practice is very doable. And there are so many resources out there that you have available to you that weren't necessarily there when I first went into private practice. So we're fortunate in that sense. But do check out the upcoming webinar that David and I are doing together. And it is, again, on scaling your practice. And you can find out more about that by going to practiceoftherapy.com/webinars. And you can also find my other webinar that I've recently released. Both of these are automated webinars. In other words, you get to pick the time at which you want to watch it. And you can find out more about it. It's using Google Workspace in private practice is the name of that webinar. And it is located too at practiceoftherapy.com/webinars. And that'll get you to the page where you can see all of the current webinars listed. And just recently put that page up as a resource for folks. If you're wanting to do just some more in-depth stuff with your practice and learning some different skills. I've got one that's going to be coming out soon, another free webinar on being on insurance panels and starting to learn about insurance. And if you want to be able to accept third-party payers in your practice. No, there's a lot of debate around that particular topic. But anyway, be sure to check it out, practiceoftherapy.com/webinars. And one other thing I want to mention here at the end, I've got an upcoming conference that I'm going to be involved in called the Faith and Practice Conference, and it's being sponsored and put on by the Practice of the Practice. Whitney Owens and Joe Sanok over there are putting this together, and I'm going to be one of the speakers at that conference, and it's going to be held down in Jekyll Island on the coast of Georgia. It's a beautiful location right on the beach, and it's going to be at the Marriott down there. And so looking forward to that. And you can find out more about that by going to practiceoftherapy.com/FIP. And that's just faith and practice, and that'll get you to the right place for that upcoming conference. It's going to be in April, and so I'd love for you to find out more about that. I think there are a few tickets left for that conference. It's going to be a smaller conference, and then it's going to be limited to 100 people. So anyway, check it out. And as always, big thanks to our sponsors of the podcast, Blueprint Health. You can find out more about them by going to practiceoftherapy.com/blueprint health. And they are a platform that will help you measure what you're doing better. And so be sure and check them out. And as always, too, be sure to check out TherapyNotes. And you can find out more about TherapyNotes by going to practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes. And when you go to that page and you want to check them out, try them out for 2 months for free, you can do that by using the promo code Gordon, just GORDON. And also, when you go to that link that I mentioned earlier for Blueprint Health, practiceoftherapy.com/blueprint health, you can try them out for 1 month, but just by simply using that link. So take care, folks. I'm looking forward to some future episodes here. Got a lot of great guests lined up. And be sure to follow the podcast wherever you might be listening to it, whether it be on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher or Google Podcasts, Amazon, Audible. All of those are places we're located, but be sure and check us out there, and be sure to follow us wherever you might listen to that. So take care, folks. Hope you have a good rest of your week. You have been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, part of the PsychCraft network of podcasts. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to receive the free Private Practice Startup Guide at practiceoftherapy.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. If you need a professional, you should find the right person for that.